Anyway, welcome on board our beautiful ship, the motor vessel PVE, as we proceed on our journey around the world. She's telling me to stop. Well, we can't wait for you. We got people. I got people over here.
Your people, she's got her people.
So you have to wait, there's still more important people. Okay, it's 2:01 now.
I give up. Anyway, we traveled east from Spain across the Mediterranean Sea on our way to the next stop. That'll be Egypt at the entrance to the Suez Canal. Today we will investigate a story of a very ancient canal. Then we'll come forward into the time of Napoleon Bonaparte and on to the modern day building and operation of the Suez Canal. Along the way, you'll hear about the Yellow Fleet and a few other troubles. Maybe next year we'll have time to explore more on Egyptian history, but for now we have to concentrate on getting through the canal. As you remember from an earlier talk, there are a bunch of Somali pirates waiting for us just at the other end of the ditch. The Suez Canal is an artificial waterway west of the Sinai Desert in northeastern Egypt. It connects the Mediterranean and Red Seas. Today, this canal provides a vital shortcut for ships carrying merchandise around the world. Now, let's go way back in time. During the early Egyptian period, the sea level was much higher than it is today. The Red Sea waters reached farther north into the desert. Thousands of years ago, ancient Egypt had a very important seagoing tradition. We now know that they traded in the Mediterranean and Red Seas, and perhaps even into the Indian Ocean. Before Marco Polo traveled to China and the Far East, and before Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, there was an amazing woman. In the 15th century BCE, Pharaoh Queen Hatshepsut had a large ocean-going ship built for trade. She sent out expeditions that brought back vast riches to Egypt from distant lands known as Punt. Possibly that's the modern-day Eritrea north of Somalia. The treasures included ivory, ebony, gold, leopard skins, and incense. 2 centuries later, a canal was constructed between the Nile Delta and the Red Sea. Archaeological evidence confirms that the pharaoh Senseret III had a channel dug along a small stream. That natural waterway flowed to the Red Sea from just south of the Great Bitter Lake. Another channel joined the River Nile with a series of lakes that were north of the Red Sea. It followed an ancient waterway called the Wadi Tumilat. Oh, that means dry creek bed. And it went across to the Great Bitter Lake. The whole canal linked the Nile River to the Red Sea. Pretty often it was blocked with sand and silt, and that meant that it pretty much had to be cleared for navigation. Carved stone reliefs from a later pharaoh depicted seagoing vessels carrying expeditionary forces. The reliefs gave rise to a belief that a navigable link existed between the Nile and the Red Sea. That waterway was documented also by early classical writers, including Aristotle. Now entered Darius, one of today's featured performers. Darius the Great, otherwise known as Darius I, was born around 550 BCE. He was an adherent to Zoroastrianism. That's a religion that we're going to talk more about when we reach India. Darius I was the 4th Persian king of the Achaemenid Empire. He kind of was convinced that he had a divine right to rule over the world. The Persian Empire invaded Egypt. They embarked on a campaign across the country and ultimately defeated the armies of the pharaoh and secured the Egyptian lands for his empire. When Persia conquered Egypt, it became the largest empire in the world, with Little Egypt just as a province. That empire at its peak included much of West Asia, the Caucasus, parts of the Balkans, most of the Black Sea coastal regions, and parts of Central Asia. It reached as far as the Indus Valley in the Far East and portions of North and Northeast Africa, including Egypt, Libya, and coastal Sudan. Wow. Darius built a canal linking the Red Sea to the River Nile, and he traveled down to Egypt in 497 BCE to open his canal. The inauguration was carried out, as you might expect, with great fanfare and celebration. Darius' canal was at least 150 feet wide. It was wide enough for two ancient Greek warships called triremes to pass each other with their oars extended. This is a graphic picture of a Greek trireme, and that's a design that lasted into the 13th century AD when it was still used by the Venetians. The point at the bow on that thing at the waterline was actually designed for ramming opponents during battle. They carried hundreds of men with as many as 3 or 4 levels of oars on each side, and the number of slaves needed to propel a trireme depended on its size. Left or right? I seriously doubt that galley slaves were given a choice of seats on the triremes. Oh, by the way, did you hear the one about the slave master on a galley who made an announcement that just thrilled the oarsmen? I have some good news. Tonight you will get double rations, and you will be allowed to go to bed at 9 p.m. Tomorrow morning you can sleep in until 10, and you will have double rations for breakfast. Oh, the slaves were just amazed. They stood up, they were cheering, they were jumping up and down. They couldn't believe how good their luck was. And then the slave master said, I also have a bit of bad news. After breakfast, the Pharaoh wants to go water skiing. Darius commemorated his achievements with granite monuments that were set up along the Nile. The monuments can be seen today alongside the Suez Canal and in the National Museum in Cairo. Accumulation of silt made repair of ancient canals increasingly cumbersome and expensive. By the 8th century AD, maintenance of the canal was no longer funded and it became unnavigable. That said, 120,000 men perished in the extension of the canal by 57 miles. That effort was abandoned because the oracle had warned Darius that enemies would benefit from the canal. Well, as luck would have it, the oracle proved correct. 3 years after a Persian defeat of Darius's forces in Greece, a revolt broke out in Egypt. That uprising took a toll on Darius's failing health, and soon after, he died. Off and on, for several thousand years during that early period, the canal was maintained, then neglected, and then rebuilt. Eventually, cost did become the major factor. Soon, all traces of Darius and the earlier canals disappeared beneath the sand. Over the centuries, the Red Sea gradually continued to recede, its northern shore moving farther and farther south. Throughout history, trade was a driving force. Among the early records of those explorations were the writings of Marco Polo. Now, that was back around 1295. His trade route, shown here in red, was mostly overland by caravan with a few short trips by ship. Over 100 years later, as shown by the little green lines, the Portuguese were looking for a sea route to India. They wanted to get spices and valuables from Asia. The red line here represents the Venetians sailing south across the Mediterranean at about 1400 AD. They met up with both Arabian caravans in yellow and Arabian ships in blue. At ports, shown with the kind of weird blinking green stars, in Turkey and Egypt, they bought goods coming from the Far East. The Arabs were bringing the goods from the east on both land caravans and ships that they controlled. And countries across Europe were paying very high prices to the Venetians who brought the goods from the Arabs, because the Arabs and the Venetians had a monopoly on that trade. The tiny little nation of Portugal wanted to find their own way to get the merchandise. From the early 15th century, the nautical school of Prince Henry the Navigator had been extending Portuguese knowledge of the west coast of Africa. Their goal was one of rounding Africa's southern extremity and then sailing on to India. By 1490, Portugal's long-term plans were beginning to come to fruition. Bartolomeu Dias, one of Henry's boys, returned from rounding the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. Another of Henry's navigators, Vasco da Gama, was born on the southwest coast of Portugal. In 1497, the king, the one of Portugal anyway, directed him to seek out lands in the east and open markets of Asia. Da Gama's ships set sail from Lisbon, following the coast of Africa. They sailed south into the open ocean, seeking westerly winds that Bartolomeu Dias had discovered. Well, you can kind of notice I knew these guys pretty well, and I can refer to them on a first-name basis once in a while. Da Gama's fleet passed the Cape of Good Hope and the Great Fish River in South Africa. Then they sailed on to into the Indian Ocean, and those were all waters that were previously unknown to the Europeans. On that voyage, in just over 3 months, Vasco's ships had sailed more than 6,000 miles of open ocean from Cape Verde Island to the Cape of Good Hope. To put that into context, that 6,000 miles was twice the distance covered by Columbus on his total first voyage. After the fleet arrived in India, da Gama returned to Portugal. He was rewarded as a man who had brought fruition to a plan that had taken 80 years to fulfill. I mean, he got titles like Lord of the Indian Seas, Admiral of the Indian Ocean. All I want to be is Admiral of the Rubber Duckies. Anyway, surely there had to be a shorter way. Nearly 300 years passed before someone took a serious interest in the Pharaohs and their canals. Guess who? Napoleon Bonaparte was fascinated by Egypt. Oh yeah, I guess that picture kind of gave the answer away, didn't it? Bonaparte was obsessed with the ancient pharaohs. He collected vast numbers of artifacts that were taken back to France. Napoleon's interest in antiquity resulted in a small army of archaeologists, scientists, map makers, and engineers scouring the area in 1798. Today, many obelisks and other ancient Egyptian items are still found throughout Paris. Napoleon wanted a modern canal to join the Mediterranean and Red Sea. In 1799, during an expedition to Egypt, he directed his chief engineer to plot the isthmus in detail in preparation for a canal. When remnants of the Pharaoh's Canal were discovered, Napoleon ordered maps outlining it, and I took the liberty of doing it in red here. It extended north from the Red Sea, then west toward the Nile River. For Napoleon's canal, the engineer mistakenly recorded a difference of around 33 feet between the levels of the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. That difference in water heights would have required a locks-based canal. The project would be too expensive and take too long to complete. Napoleon abandoned the idea. Ferdinand de Lesseps, you kind of remember him, I hope, from the Panama Canal talk. He was a civil engineer born in 1805 in Versailles, France. He's best known as the developer of the Suez Canal in 1869. When de Lesseps arrived in Egypt, he found the designs for a canal were already in place. But none of his predecessors had the political skill or even the willpower necessary to move the project forward. In 1854, the Viceroy of Egypt signed an agreement with de Lesseps. That document said the canal was to be built according to the plans that had been created by an Austrian engineer, and it was to be open to ships of all nations. By 1858, de Lesseps established the Suez Canal Company with offices in Alexandria, Egypt, Alexandria, Egypt, and Paris, France. The business was owned by both French and Egyptian interests. The contract was to build a canal and administer it for 99 years. At the end of that contract period, ownership was to be turned over to the Egyptian government. In 1859, the Suez Canal Company broke ground on the project. But they were up against some of the same problems that the pharaohs had faced thousands of years earlier: sandstorms. Excavation took nearly 11 years using slave labor. Over 30,000 people were forced to work on the canal by the Egyptian government. Controversy arose over the use of the involuntary labor. Armed Bedouin bands began causing a revolt among the canal workers. The Sultan of Turkey, who by the way had political domination over Egypt at the time, had abolished slavery, and the work stopped. De Lesseps overcame the labor issue by replacing manpower with steam engines, excavators, dredgers, and all kinds of other heavy machinery. The canal engineers found remnants of the Pharaoh's Canal that passed through several Egyptian cities. That discovery was made during the construction of a thing called the Sweetwater Canal. The Sweetwater Canal runs along the northern periphery of a dry riverbed from a very ancient time. It extends from Port Said in the north all the way to the south to Suez. The concept and the design was to supply drinking water to nearby citizens. Construction of that canal was completed in 1863. And yes, it is still in use today, but I would defy anyone to take a chance of drinking the water. De Lesseps pushed forward on his primary project. The bottom line is that the project took longer than anticipated and cost much more than planned. Anybody familiar with that in contract work? Although numerous technical, political, and financial problems had been overcome, the final cost was over $300 million. And that's $300 million in then-year dollars back in the mid-1800s. So run that forward, it's kind of a backbreaker. That was more than double the original estimate. In 1869, the Suez Canal was inaugurated with pomp and ceremony. Empress Eugenie, the wife of Napoleon II, was there to host the party. The ceremony was also attended by representatives of most European governments. Opening the Suez Canal had an immediate and dramatic effect on world travel and trade. The canal reduced the distance between Saudi Arabia and the Mediterranean Sea by over 10,000 miles. 28 days were cut from the time for a ship traveling around the Cape of Good Hope at 15 knots, which, by the way, is a pretty aggressive speed for ships in that era. European activities in Asia and Africa increased as distance and time to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean were significantly reduced. Ships previously traveled from Europe to the Far East, that's shown here with that black line. They no longer had to use ports along the West African coast or to stop at islands in the Indian Ocean. They had been stopping in those unstable and pretty often dangerous countries for things like fuel and provision and water, and sometimes even for repairs. The American Transcontinental Railroad had also just been completed, and I put that up there in red. Travelers could now board a ship and sail east from Spain through the Suez Canal and on to San Francisco. The travelers could then get off the ship, walk across the pier, jump on a train, and take the train across to New York. And when they got to New York, they could take a cab down to the waterfront, get back on the ship, and continue their trip around the world. Trains weren't all that fast at that time, however. Soon the trip would be made even faster by the completion of another canal. De Lesseps attempted to repeat his success and build a canal in Panama. As you recall, that project was abandoned by the French after several years. Their problems were complicated by, finances, corruption, technical problems, and of course the all-present disease. But the Panama Canal was ultimately completed by the Americans. Guess what time it is? We've been sitting a little bit too long, so it's now time for the world-famous PVE stretch. Because we just opened the Suez Canal, we want to get up, if you can, or sit where you are, and walk like an Egyptian to celebrate. Here goes. See. Yeah, but they're caving in over here. The Convention of Constantinople was a pact that was agreed upon in 1888. It was signed by the United Kingdom, Germany, Austro-Hungary, Spain, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. That treaty established neutrality for the Suez Canal. It guaranteed passage to ships of all nations during peace and war. During the negotiation period, the United Kingdom obtained a substantial financial interest in control of the canal. Well, we're going to move forward now to get into more recent events. King Farouk I ascended to the throne of Egypt in 1936 when his father, King Fahd, died. Farouk was only 15 years old, and for 16 years he was best known for a pretty lavish lifestyle. He was widely condemned for the Egyptian army's failure in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War to prevent the creation of the State of Israel. The Egyptian Revolution was begun on July 23rd in 1952 by what was called the Free Officers Movement. That was a group of army officers led by Mohammed Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser. The revolution was initially aimed at overthrowing King Farouk, and it worked because shortly thereafter he abdicated his throne. The government was controlled by the Revolution Command Council, made up of members of the Free Officers Movement, and they were led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was elected as the second president of the Republic in 1957. Well, in the meanwhile, Egypt was backed by both the Soviet Union and the United States, and they remained united in its opposition to the British and French in regard to the Suez Canal. The British refused to transfer control of the canal to the new regime. Well, that didn't quite work out because in September 1955, Egypt announced an arms deal for the Soviet support and their recognition of the People's Republic of China. Egypt requested international support for construction of the High Aswan Dam on the Nile River. Well, that didn't work because most countries refused to fund the project. The Soviet Union did agree to help with conditions. They always had conditions. They wanted more political influence over the Suez, over Egypt, and the Aswan Dam. And they wanted greater access to Egyptian cotton and grain. In 1956, Egypt announced nationalization of the Suez Canal. Nationalization, or seizure of ownership by the government, led to the establishment of the Suez Canal Authority, replacing the Suez Canal Company. The state authority still owns and maintains the canal. Nasser wanted the canal nationalized for more control. Egypt planned to use income from the canal to help finance construction of the Aswan Dam. He didn't want the British nor the French involved any longer. At the time, Israel saw its chance to gain control of the Sinai Desert, so they invaded Egyptian territory. Soon, the Suez Crisis broke out. Britain and France joined Israel and sent troops to the desert. The enraged Egyptians said, "All right, that's it," and they sank 40 ships in the canal, closing it to all traffic. The world, however, was really worried because of the sides were kind of getting into it, and the crisis might eventually lead to a nuclear war. Because remember, the Soviets were involved, the Israelis were involved, the Americans were involved, and it was a pretty rare time. To stop the war from spreading, Canadian politician Lester B. Pearson stepped in. He proposed the creation of the first United Nations peacekeeping force. The peacekeepers were to ensure access to the Suez Canal by all nations. In November 1956, the UN approved Pearson's plan. And oh, by the way, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for that effort. Sunken ships and debris were cleared with assistance from the United Nations. It was their peacekeepers who maintained the neutrality of the canal. The Suez reopened in 1957. UN forces were to stay on the Sinai Peninsula for 10 more years. After the conflict, Egypt agreed to pay millions of dollars to shareholders of the old Suez Canal Company. Those investors had lost huge amounts of money through the nationalization process. Conflict again closed the canal in 1967. Oh, by the way, that's right after the UN peacekeepers left. It was known as the Six-Day Arab-Israeli War. Israel attacked Egypt, provoking them to sink ships at each end of the Suez Canal, and this is the ones that are shown at the north end. 15 other ships were trapped in the canal at the Great Bitter Lake. Nasser proclaimed that the canal would remain closed until all foreign troops left the Sinai. As a result, the Suez remained closed to traffic for 8 years. The ships in the Great Bitter Lake accumulated thick layers of sand and dust. The dust gave the ships a ghostly kind of yellow-tan appearance, and they became known as the Yellow Fleet. Now you know. One thing that makes the Suez unique among canals is the weather. Sandstorms can be a major problem. Visibility drops to 0. Radar is practically useless because it gets a big white screen on it from all the sand and debris in the air. Ships must stop and wait out the storm, and sometimes wait out the war or the economy or the whatever. By 1975, the Suez Canal was reopened with a few restrictions, mainly against Israel. Egypt established rules on who could and who could not transit the canal. A 1979 peace treaty opened the Suez to everyone on an unrestricted basis. The Camp David Accord, brokered by President Jimmy Carter, established a treaty between Israel and Egypt. And the Suez Canal has remained open and navigable without interruption ever since. The canal is even visible in the blue marble photograph taken from the moon by the Apollo astronauts in 1972. It's circled here in red. There is a great contrast between the canal waters and the surrounding desert sand. As an aside, even though the canal isn't any bigger than the Great Wall of China, the Great Wall of China cannot be seen from space because the stone on the Great Wall is the same color as the stone on the surrounding ground. That's another little trivia thing for you if you ever play trivia. Today, 2/3 of Europe's oil and 10% of the sea trade between the Orient and Europe passes through this canal. The Suez Canal represents one of mankind's great passageways, and it connects continents and cultures. However, the Suez Canal has had somewhat of an adverse environmental impact. It opened a free-flowing water passage between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. The current in the canal flows from south to north, not real fast, but just fast enough to be a steady current. The Red Sea is saltier and more nutrient poor than the Mediterranean. In addition to the Red Sea jellyfish, over 80 species of mollusk and fish have invaded the Mediterranean, and very few have gone the other way. The Malabar grouper, doesn't he look cute? Little blue-eyed baby. He was first found north of the Suez in 1969. This grouper is larger and much more aggressive than the species that are native in the Mediterranean. It is one of the many forms of that will eventually spread across the Mediterranean and ultimately out into the Atlantic. They could wipe out the common fish species that are used for food around the Mediterranean and perhaps even in the eastern Atlantic. Now let's take a virtual sail or trip through the Suez Canal. At the Mediterranean end of the canal is Port Said. Ships arrange for transit, pay their tolls, and wait there for their turn. The average per ship toll is roughly $251,000. Toll receipts from the canal in 2018 totaled $5.58 billion. Today, some 21,500 vessels pass through each year, and that represents about 13% of the world's shipping traffic. The Suez Canal is 101 miles long. Passage takes up to 16 hours at a speed of 8 knots. Low speed prevents erosion of the banks by the ship's wakes, and that speed is very carefully controlled by the Egyptian authorities. Now, the canal is not the shortest distance across the Isthmus of the Suez. It follows what was once the Red Sea for nearly all of its length. The canal uses 3 natural lakes all along the route. The Great Bitter Lake that we talked about earlier is used as a passing area. For most of its length, the Suez has a single lane with several passing areas. There is today a second canal channel that parallels the original, and that allows for greater traffic. This photo was taken by Ken Lyons, who also you may know from here, and you can see a ship passing in that second canal. 3 convoys transit the canal on a typical day. All ships have to be in convoys. There are 2 southbound and 1 northbound. Since the southbound convoys are steaming against that current, they're just a little bit slower. When traveling from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea through the Suez, ships usually arrive usually quite a bit before sunrise and wait their turn. And they're divided into convoys depending on their size, their cargo, their maneuverability, and sometimes just the whim of the harbor master. The southbound ships are always divided into 2 convoys. The first convoy enters the canal in the early morning and proceeds to one of the passing areas or to the Great Bitter Lake. They anchor there or moor out of the channel and wait for the passage of the northbound convoy. Because of the current, the northbound convoys can proceed at a slightly faster speed. Their ship speed in relation to the water is still 8 knots, but because of the current flow, they're actually moving a little bit faster. Now, the northbound convoy will then pass the southbound convoy, and that's the one that's moored alongside the canal in a bypass area. The only times ships will pass is when one of them is at anchor, moored, or in one of the wide passing areas, and now in some of those parallel canals. Controls placed on traffic in this canal have resulted in very few mishaps ever being recorded. Of course, those mishaps don't include the sinking of ships intentionally at each end or even in the middle of the canal. The northbound convoy will stop at a passing area farther to the north to allow the second southbound convoy to pass. This may occur where there are 2 separate canal lanes, as shown here in another one of Ken Lyons' photographs. Along our journey, you may notice a train, or maybe 2 of them, passing by. The railway runs parallel to the canal for most of its length. It moves passengers between towns along the canal. It also carries some cargo that's offloaded from ships that, because of their draft, had to be lightened before transiting the canal. There are 3 ferries crossing over the length of the canal that move vehicles across. In addition, 4 tunnels are being built under the canal to speed traffic to the Sinai Peninsula. As you travel along, you'll pass under the Suez Canal Bridge. Like a lot of other places in the world, it has multiple names. It's also called the Mubarak Peace Bridge, or the Egyptian-Japanese Friendship Bridge, or the Alcantara Bridge. Anyway, the towers were designed to look like Egyptian obelisks. This high-level road bridge is in an area known as Alcantara. And so, if you don't speak Arabic, I'll tell you, Alcantara means the bridge. The El Ferdan Railway Bridge is located at a city near the midpoint of the canal. The bridge was completed in 2001. It's the longest swing-span bridge in the world, with a span of 1,100 feet. El Ferdan, by the way, is the name of a town. It doesn't mean the bridge. At the south end of the canal is Port Suez. It's at the entrance to the Red Sea. Now, this is a photograph of recent developments in that port. Today, Port Suez is a very modern city with architecture that reflects a much earlier age. New construction and an economy bolstered by the Suez Canal are vital to the area. Revenue gained from ships, particularly oil tankers, is the lifeblood for the Egyptian government. Even though the Suez Canal could accommodate very large ships, there were limitations. Some, particularly oil tankers, outgrew it, and container ships were pushing its limits. In 2014, the Egyptian government undertook an $8 billion expansion project for the canal. It widened the Suez from 200 feet to 1,023 feet for 21 miles. The project took 1 year to complete, and as a result, the canal can now accommodate ships that can pass sometimes in both directions simultaneously. Today, an average of 50 ships navigate the canal every day. They carry more than 300 million tons of goods every year. Now, the next time, the motor vessel PVE will virtually sail to East Africa, arriving there on October 1st. Yes, that means no other lecture this month. My researcher, director, writer, and best friend needs a little time off. Oh, geez, it's so hard to get good help these days. And that's it for today. Now, there are copies of how to get to the videos on Pulse and on YouTube that are over on the refreshment table, which only has water for refreshment. So it's on the water table, I guess. So we will see you on October 1st at 2 p.m. right here in Rawlinson Hall. By then, if our old ship, the MV PVE, hasn't broken down again, we'll be in East Africa. First up will be the story of Stanley and Livingstone and the country of Tanzania, although some people call it Tanzania. Then we'll sail on to Kenya. Here we'll delve into the natural and cultural history of the country and its people. Now remember, it was in Kenya that the Leakeys discovered a human skull that was over 1.5 million years old. There are even footprints that are nearly 4 million years old. Now, does anybody have any questions about today's presentation? Yes, ma'am.
Do they have pilots that get on the ship to take it through the canal like they do in Panama?
She asked, do they have pilots that get on a ship? Yes, they do. As a matter of fact, that canal and Panama both require pilots. There is a slight difference between the pilots on canals at the Panama and Suez. The pilots in Panama take total responsibility for the safety of the ship all the way through the canal. But as a captain of a ship, I'd be really reluctant to let them really have that responsibility. Where in the Suez, the pilot is only there for navigation. The master of the ship is still responsible for his ship. Yes, sir.
Because of the sandstorms, are they dredged regularly? Or
He asked, because of sandstorms, are they dredged regularly? It's kind of like the Golden Gate Bridge. They constantly dredge. They start at one end and work their way to the other end, and then they start back at the beginning and go again. It's the same way they paint the bridge. They start at the north end and paint to the south end, and then go back to the north and start all over again.
Earlier you said they estimated the levels were 33 feet. What are the actual?
The actual difference in feet between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean is about 4.5 feet. So it's a very, over 100 and something miles of current is really not that big a deal. But that difference that the engineers came up with, the 33 feet, it would have been kind of like Panama. They would have had to have used locks because the flow would have been too great. Yes, sir.
So how long is it going to take for the Mediterranean to fill up?
Well, the Mediterranean is still draining into the Atlantic. And because of lower rainfall and everything else in the Caucasus and the Black Sea region and everything else, the Mediterranean isn't changing its water level. Eventually what will happen, my opinion, with all of the ice melting in the Arctic and the Antarctic, the water levels are going to go the other way. So not only will the Red Sea fill greater, but so will the Mediterranean. Maybe if it goes long enough, you won't need a canal. You'll just be able to go right straight through. Yes, ma'am.
Did you say that the widening process was done in 1 year?
Yes, it was. She asked if the widening process was done in a year. Yes, it was. Now, the big difference, when you go back to de Lesseps' time, in 1900, was that the equipment back then wasn't all that sophisticated. Now they've got huge, powerful machines and massive amounts of equipment that's available to them. And also, they already had a basic canal dug. So they could take these gigantic dredges and just run them down the side of the canal from one end to the other and pump sand way out into the desert. Oh, by the way, my shirt and pants and Susie's outfit, that's because we might want to hide in the sand if we ever go to the desert. Yes, sir.
About the recent attacks on the ships, what authority, who controls
Are you talking about the ships up in the Persian Gulf or the?
that was attacked by Iran?
Oh, that's in a whole different part of the world. The attacks on ships by Iran is way up in the Straits of Hormuz, up between the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf. And that doesn't affect the Suez at all.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bill.
do our naval warships go through the canal or other nations' warships?
Yeah, he asked if the warships go through the canal. For a long time, our Navy said they would not allow our capital ships, the carriers and the cruisers and the battleships and stuff like that, to go through the canals because they were always afraid the ships would get in the canal and somebody would sink ships at each end and they'd be trapped there. During Vietnam, the Intrepid and several other carriers went through the canal on their way to Southeast Asia. And today the ships go through. I have to tell you, if I was a fleet commander and there was kind of bubbling unrest in the area, I'd be I would be a little concerned about just heading south through the Suez Canal, knowing that I could get trapped in there. And of course, an aircraft carrier is hopeless if they're trapped because they can't launch their planes. But yes, they go through all the time now. Now, the major carriers don't go through the Panama Canal. They go around, or they go through the Suez. And that's because the belief is that the Panama would be easier to plug than the other canals, and it also is a very restricted waterway for both width and depth right now. Yes, ma'am.
Is it safe and interesting to take the cruise through the Panama Canal?
She asks, is it safe and interesting? Okay, I'll tell you, both canals are really interesting, and actually they're both pretty safe. The Panama Canal it's kind of like taking a trip down the Mississippi River with locks. I mean, it's controlled by a government that's pretty friendly. The people there are very friendly. The currency they use is the U.S. dollar. They don't even have their own currency. They've always relied on the dollar. And so it's just like you could take the ship from Sacramento to San Francisco, and it's almost kind of the same sort of a trip. The Suez is different. I mean, the Panama Canal, you're going through a jungle, and there's things to see, there's animals, there's locks, there's lots of activity. The Suez is really interesting, but you're going through a desert. And there's a big city at one end and a big city at the other end and a couple of little towns along the way, and the rest of the time it's sand. So it's not as interesting, but it's safe right now. Anybody else? Okay, remember there's things to get to how you get to the lectures over there on the table, and I'd like to thank you very much for the gift of your time today.